Hello, ladies and gents. Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Kovu. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different from what we usually do. Today we'll be reading a story, a Palian lore book. It has to do with the Temple of the Flames, as it talks about the Kitsuu. So I figured, why not read this book? This book is called The Kitsuu and the Moon. Without further ado, I'm going to read it, so you don't have to. Let's get into it. Once upon a time, when only Grand Ignis hung in the sky, there lived deep in a forest a small Kitsuu. Like all Kitsuus, she loved shiny things, and so one midsummer evening, as she tracked a shimmerfly in the air with her eyes, her gaze lifted to the skies, where she caught sight of the moon. "Oh my, how bright, how beautiful!" she exclaimed. To no one in particular, her eyes sparkled in the moonlight as she contemplated how to collect a piece of Ignis for herself. She scampered through the forest until she found the tallest tree, scrambling past startled Mugen as she climbed and climbed and climbed. As she reached the top, she saw that the forest she had thought her spacious home was just a small patch of trees in a much larger landscape. As she looked up hopefully at the moon with her ears perked up, she realized it seemed just as far as it had when she had been on the ground. The tips of her ears drooped just a little, but as she dropped her gaze from the sky, she saw a cliff off in the distance, taller than the tree on which she was perched. And so off she went, scampering down the tree and off towards the cliff in the distance. As she got closer and closer, she realized just how big a task she had ahead of her. The cliff rose higher and higher until at last she was at the base looking up at an incline that seemed to reach all the way to the very same moon she wanted to catch. The Kitsuu puffed up her chest and started on her climb. Onward and onward she ran, upward and upward she climbed, and yet further and further the moon seemed to be. As she got close to the edge of the cliff, the Kitsuu flopped down in exhaustion and bewilderment, for she was no closer to the moon than she was a cliff's height ago. Drained of all her energy, the Kitsuu slept for a while, and when she woke up from her well-earned slumber, it was light out, and the moon, while still beautiful, was not the only light illuminating the landscape. And there was so much more to see. The little Kitsuu had not realized how vast the world was, and how much there was in it. As she scurried along the cliffside, the mossy side she had climbed gave way to a darker, sharper edge. She slowed to a careful crawl, and peering over the edge, she saw that the cliffs here ended by plunging into a soft bed of sand, punctuated by the occasional rock formations. Ever so soft. One of the formations burst forth with a geyser, shooting into the sky, and as she watched one erupt, she realized that she was looking up at the top of it, gasping in the light. She took a breath, puffing out her chest once more, and waited for the geyser to drop below her. Before she could change her mind, she gathered up all of her tiny courage and flung herself over the edge as the geyser erupted once again. As the Kitsuu was launched into the air, she had a moment of vertigo as she flipped and flipped, head over tail, tail over head, with a splash of sideways. Almost overwhelmed by the dizziness, she channeled her inner silver wing and spread her limbs taut so her thick fur could stretch out and catch the air, letting her gently hover above the peaks of the geyser. Up and down, up again she bobbed, as she looked around in a bubbling excitement that quickly fizzled as the novelty wore off. She was high, higher than she had ever been before, but the moon looked no closer than it had on the cliff or in the tree. She was closer to an expansive body of water she had never even seen before then, the moon she had been admiring this whole time. The ocean glistened all over as it undulated in the wind, so vast she could see it in an entirety. And while she had to admit that it was beautiful, Her heart was still set on the moon, and it still seemed impossibly far. In fact, it was hard to keep her beloved moon in sight as she bobbed up and down, up and down. She couldn't stay up here forever. As relaxing as it was, she was still stretched taut. As she contemplated her next move, she saw a mountain whose peaks disappeared into the clouds. Surely, that was where she would be able to meet the moon. So she pondered and plotted, and the next time the geyser shot her in the air, she aimed herself at the mountain, stretched her paws as far as they would go, and then stretched just a little further than that, and glided as best as she could towards the nearest geyser. And so she made her way, geyser to geyser, shooting up, sailing through the air, bit by bit, towards the mountain off the distance. Eventually, she found herself landing amongst the trees growing from the base of the mountain. Puffing up her chest one last time, the fur in her chest rippling with energy, she began to climb once more. She scampered across the ground. She scurried up the trees. She climbed small cliffs. She glided through the air until one day, as the sun was setting, she broke through the last of the trees and found nothing else above her. As the last of the wash of pinks and oranges faded from the sky, and the moon brightened above her, she knew she had made it. She had reached the top. Her ears twitched as she looked up triumphantly to greet the moon. And yet, it was just as far as it was before the mountain, the geyser, the cliff, the tree. It looked the same as when she had first laid eyes on it. She looked around desperately for something, somewhere even higher than where she was now. But there was nothing to be found. There was nowhere higher she could explore. The Kitsuu deflated in defeat. Crestfallen, she returned home to her forest, her head hanging low, ears drooping heavily, tail dragging in the moss. Night after day after night, she aimlessly wandered around and around and around until one night she stumbled into a dark clearing. Startled, she looked up and saw the moon, as distant as ever. In despair, she collapsed into a puddle of fur on the ground and began to cry. She begged for someone, for anyone, to help her reach the moon. "I have climbed the tallest tree," she explained. "I have scaled the tallest cliff," she shouted. "I have ridden the tallest geysers," she wailed. "I have conquered the tallest mountain," she howled. I just want to be friends," she whimpered, exhausted. She rested her weary head on her paws and let her tears form tiny rivers down her face, across her toes, and onto the ground, where they began to form a pool. Her pleas echoed far and wide, eventually reaching the three ancients. The phoenix, preoccupied with saving her noisy, wayward people, did not hear her appeals. The chimera, his far and quiet solitude broken, turned to face away from the chittering noise and watched instead the technological marvels his inventive and clever people had begun to develop. But the dragon, still in its youth and without its own people, could remember what it was like to yearn, as its own nebulous yearning had brought it into being not so many years ago. But that's another story for another day. And so, the dragon took pity on the poor Kitsuu, gathering the dust of the stars and shaping a small, humble moon in its claws, carefully balancing it in the sky above the pool that had formed from her tears. And as the pool grew large enough that the Kitsu's paws were dipped in it. Her tears began to twinkle as she fell directly into the water. Startled by the sound, the Kitsu looked up, and lo and behold, she saw the reflection of Luna shining back at her. "Why, hello," she exclaimed happily, circling the edge of her pool around and around while the moon stayed centered and full, beaming back at her in delight. The dragon spoke then, its voice a deep rumble that she could feel through all of her fur and whiskers. "Your new companion," it explained, "will wander, just as you have wandered, but will always return, just as you have returned. You are no longer alone." And as it watched the Kitsu settle down into a happy, peaceful slumber, lit by the two moons, it began to contemplate its own loneliness. But alas, that is yet another story for yet another day. My name is Kovu. This has been the Kitsuu and the Moon. Thank you guys for listening if you made it this far. Yeah. Love you guys. Goodbye.